Hey everybody, Professor Simons here. Let's do a short video. Why a short video? Because it's past midnight, my girlfriend's already asleep, and I forgot that I had to record one of these. Let's talk about narration. Narration is basically everything that you have to take into account when you're figuring out how a story is told, how the story is actually delivered to you, the reader. Who's our narrator? What's the point of view? What's the focus? Is it past tense, present tense? All these things fit into narration. Let's start with first person. This is Fozzie Bear. Fozzie Bear is our main character. Fozzie Bear is telling us his story as he lives it directly. That is first person. The narrator oh boy, sorry Fozzie. The narrator is actually telling us his story as he lives it. And there's some pros and some cons to this. One of the big pros is you get to understand this character incredibly well. You get to understand what he's thinking, what his voice sounds like, what he's experiencing in any given moment. And that's a big pro. But there's also some cons. One of the cons to first person is you have a very limited scope. Things that are not happening to Fozzie Bear, you may not know about them. People who are experiencing life who are not Fozzie Bear, you may not understand why they're doing things, what they're thinking. So some pros and some cons. For me, one of the biggest pros to first person is the story's happening immediately. You feel like the story is happening to you instantly in that moment because the pronouns are I. I did this. I went here. I experienced this thing. And that makes the story feel more immediate. There's also one of my favorite things that you can do with a first person narrator is have an unreliable narrator. Unreliable narrator means, for whatever reason, our narrator might not be telling us the truth. It might be because he's crazy. It might be because he's drunk. It might be because our main character is on some kind of weirdo pills and psychedelics. Or it might just be because our main character has severe brain damage. But no matter what the reason, an unreliable narrator is fascinating because you have to figure out as the reader if the things that our narrator is telling us are even true in the first place. Next, we have third person. Third person means we still have Fozzie. Fozzie's still living his life and experiencing his events and his story. But Fozzie's not the one telling us his story. Instead, we have a narrator who is telling us the story kind of from above, on his own or her own or its own, whatever you consider the narrator, telling us the story directly. So again, there's some pros and some cons. One of the pros is now you get everything that's happening in the world around Fozzie because our narrator can see, understand, and tell us all of that. One of the cons is that means you lose a little bit of understanding of Fozzie because you're no longer in his head. Instead, you're in the narrator's world, learning about the entire events of the story. So, with a third-person narrator, the scope of the story is bigger because you can see everything that's happening around Fozzie. But the actual depth is a little bit more shallow because Fozzie, we don't really understand him as much. We don't see as much of him. There's a couple of different ways you can see a third-person story. One of the most common ones, is our narrator is omniscient. He or she is basically God, floating above the entire story, understanding everything, and telling us the story as he or she sees fit. The other common type of third-person narrator you see is limited. The narrator still knows everything, but really is only interested in our one main character. Doesn't care that much about what's happening outside of the world, even though our narrator knows everything. One other thing that's kind of tricky that you may want to understand about third person is the difference between main character, narrator, and author. The author of the story is not the same as the narrator. Even if Edgar Allan Poe writes a story where the narrator is a third-person character, that character is not technically Edgar Allan Poe. So, you've got the main character, behind him you may have the narrator, and then behind all of them, you've got the writer. Look at that. That's a handsome writer. Finally, you have the weirdest type of narration, which is second person. Second person is super weird because now we've got Fozzie. Fozzie is experiencing his life, and we still have some kind of narrator. But weirdly enough, it's like the narrator is directly talking to Fozzie and saying, you do this. You go to this place. You experience this thing. You think about this. The pronoun for second person is always you, and it's super weird. It's something you might see in like a choose-your-own-adventure story. Like, do you go in the spooky barn or not? Kind of a weird way of telling a story. But, oddly enough, later on in the course, we will read one story that is in second person. Okay, so, Hopefully that was a quick little primer and narration. I know we've already talked about some of it, and some of it you may already know, but just as a short reminder. First person, Fozzie's telling us his story. Why is it good? Because we get to understand Fozzie. Why is it bad? Because we miss out on some of the things happening around Fozzie. Second person, the narrator is directly talking to Fozzie and telling him what to do. You go here, you do this. Why is it good? It's creative. It makes you feel like you as the reader are part of the story. What's the negative? It seems really crazy and really strange and sometimes off-putting. And last, we've got third person. Fozzie's living his life, and the narrator is telling us, the reader, what's actually happening. All right, that's it. Thank you for watching. See you next time.